Hello student, welcome back to the session. We are going to start with the types of constructors. Different types of constructors. All these questions individually carries 5 marks. That is the types: default constructor, parameterized constructor, and copy constructor. Now the first one is your default constructor. What do you mean by your default value? The values that are in the beginning itself is known as your default values. So a constructor that accepts no parameters. When we are saying parameters, it is also known as your arguments or values or variables, right? So a constructor that accepts no parameters is known as your default constructor. So objects are created just like any other normal variable. There are two ways in which you can give the syntax for this, that is inside the class definition and outside the class definition. Now we are going to go for your inside the class definition. So give the class, that is a keyword, and then the class name, and then private data members, and then public. Give a constructor name and close. This is one of the syntaxes. That's for inside the class definition. You can have in one more way, that is outside the class definition. Here you are going to give the class name, give the scope resolution operator, and then your constructor name, and then your statements, whichever are necessary. Okay, so this is the way you are going to give the syntax for outside the class definition. If you are going to go for an example here, the earlier examples, if you remember, we said class and test. This is your keyword, right? And this is your class name, and then you are going to give it a private integer number, right? And then public, you are supposed to give the constructor name. So what is the constructor name you are going to give? It should be the same as your class name. So that is test, but with the function. This is your constructor. Okay, then remember, here you are not giving any values here, no values. So that means it is your default constructor. Close. This is your no value, that means a default constructor. Okay, this is the way you are supposed to give the syntax or use it in your programming for the default constructor, that it did not contain any values, no values. Okay, now what are the advantages now of having this default constructor, or using advantages and disadvantages of your default constructor? What are the advantages? One advantage is that it can be called with no arguments. You need not think about send any values, so no arguments. And then these performs, it has default initialization. That we had said earlier. What do you mean by initialization? Default initialization. And it can be defined outside the class also. Outside the class also. It can be defined outside the class also. So these are the advantages of your default constructor. Now, what are the disadvantages? Whenever you have an advantage, there will always be a disadvantage also. So, what are those disadvantages? The first disadvantage is that multiple objects cannot be initialized. Multiple objects cannot be initialized using your default constructors. And then many objects of the same class are initialized with the same values by the default constructor, which is a problem later. Many objects will be initialized. Many objects will be initialized with same values, which is not valid. Okay, and default constructors cannot be overloaded. They cannot be overloaded. So these are the disadvantages of default constructors. Now, how do you overcome this? We overcome this with the help of parameterized constructor. That is the second constructor, the parameterized constructor. Now, what do you mean by this parameterized constructor? Parameterized constructor, as we said, in default constructor you cannot have any values, but sometimes we need to send values. You cannot always initialize the values. For example, sum is equal to 0 or product equals 1. We cannot always initialize the values with 0 and 1. You need some other in between values also. For example, if you are going to start from 11 to 20, so the first value need to be 11. So it is not the initial value, somewhere in between. So it is a specific value. So we are going to make use of the parameterized constructors. Parameterized constructors, that means that you can give any specific value which you want to use. So the constructors that can accept the parameters is known as parameterized constructors. The definition: constructors that can accept the parameters. Parameters are nothing but values or variables. It's called a parameterized constructor. Once the parameterized constructor is declared, you cannot make use of the default constructor. The default constructor cannot be called. Okay. So what is the syntax for this parameterized constructor? Again, use the keyword class and then give class name and then private data member. Member functions are used in public. So public, here we are going to use the class name. This is nothing but your constructor name. Remember, this is nothing but your constructor. It's the same as your class name. So give the type of data type and then the argument 1, data type, argument 2, and so on. And then give your statements. It can be either 1 or more than 1 and close. This is how what you mean by your parameterized. This is you are going to give the values or parameters. That is your parameterized constructor. Now for an example, earlier example we took class and test, right? And under private you are giving integer number, and under public you are using public. The class name is the same as your constructor name, remember, and then int value. This is your parameter. This is your parameter. This is your constructor name. Okay, and then you are assigning that value into number. The value is stored in number, and then cout value of number equals num close. Right, this is your example. And if you go for your main program, void main, this is the class name, the object, and this is just an example I'm showing you. Now this is valid because you are using the parameter. It is a parameterized constructor, whereas this is invalid because no argument is given, so it is cannot be used for your parameterized constructor. Only this is a valid parameterized constructor. Okay, this is about your parameterized constructor. Now what are the advantages or the features of your parameterized constructor? Can I also either say it as a features or advantages? It can be parameterized constructors can be overloaded. Remember, default constructors cannot be overloaded, whereas they can be parameterized constructors can be overloaded. They can also have default values depending on the program. If you want default values, you can have using a parameterized constructor also. If an object is created with one object, a constructor invokes or calls with one argument only, and a parameterized constructor can be called. Parameterized constructor can be called in three ways, that is implicitly, explicitly, or using initialization. Using, that is a assignment symbol. Single equal represents your assignment symbol, that is assigning the values from left side to the right side. So when you are talking about implicit, invoking, calling the constructor, that is a parameterized constructor implicitly, here the compiler will decide. The compiler decides the parameters to a function automatically. It passes, implicit call passes initial values or arguments to the constructor internally. We are not going to give any values. It is given by the compiler itself. So that is your implicit. And how are you going to call this? The syntax, again the class name or nothing but your constructor name and object name, argument 1, argument 2, that depends on how many you are going to call. This is your implicit call. The other is your explicit. Invoking a parameterized constructor explicitly. That is, explicit call passes the initial values as arguments to the constructor externally. Explicit means you are sending the values to the function. The syntax for this is class name, object name, that equals constructor, argument 1, argument 2. Okay, this is your explicit call. Explicitly you are passing the values. Prefixing the explicit word to the constructor tells the compiler that we are sending the values, no need for implicit values. And initialization using assignment, that's the third one. Initialization using the assignment symbol. Initializing this method is used when the constructor has got only one value. For example, you are using public, right? Giving the name of the constructor, that is, for example, test integer a, and then x equals a. So you are using implicit, that is your assignment symbol equals to give the value. This is the way you are going to call a parameterized constructor. It can be done either explicitly, implicitly, or using an assignment operator. We'll continue with the copy constructor in the next session.